Hey everyone, and welcome to the Priv8 Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E. Silva. Today we're speaking with Markus Lampinen. Markus is the co-founder and CEO at Prifina. He is a product-focused entrepreneur working with paradigm shifts like data, fintech, and content rights from Hong Kong, London, New York, and San Francisco. Markus has studied economics, those being incentives and psychology, and information systems, and is passionate about personal freedom. And now, over to the interview with Markus Lampinen. Markus, thanks a lot for being here on Priv8 today, especially on what is for you and I a Friday afternoon.
That's right. No, thank you, Derek, for having me. It's a pleasure.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording here about traveling and about basically being sick of COVID, and hopefully the next little while gets uh, more travel friendly over the rest of 2022. But let's give everybody listening a little bit of background about you. What inspired your interest in entrepreneurship, fintech data? Like how did Markus come to be at this point now,
Mm,
being the head of Prifina?
awesome. Yeah, from sick of COVID to kind of looking at the history. It was just kind of as an aside. I'm a Finnish engineer by background, so the start of COVID, I was like, yes, no commute. That was like my first, literally, honest to God, my first thought. No commute. And then I didn't realize that I was no commute for 20 some months, but that came after. So I'm Finnish by background. I live here in San Francisco. I'm a reluctant Silicon Valley immigrant because I thought that every tech founder was coming to Silicon Valley. I didn't want to do that, but I ended up here anyway during my fintech company. So I've always been very data driven. I've always been very interested in numbers and numbers explaining behavior as well as aiding decision making. I started my first company in content libraries and content rights with the streaming platforms, trying to figure out how royalties are traced back. Perfect use case for blockchain. 17 years early for that. Well, maybe a little bit less. And then after that, I started looking at 2008, 2009. There was the crowdfunding peer-to-peer investment loans market boom. And then we started looking at, okay, why don't we essentially give developers tools so that they could build the next banks and the next investment banks, hedge funds, marketplaces, lenders, whatnot, very early. So that essentially was part of getting crowdfunding legalized in 2011, 2012 in the US. And then this company is called Diffitech. And we ended up growing it to support various different types of developers around the world building new types of financial marketplaces. But I think one of the commonalities that I had in looking at these companies was that they obviously all dealt with a bunch of data. And the data landscape, it sort of shifted in around 2014, 2015 with the inception of GDPR. Well, before that, the right to be forgotten, then GDPR, and then some
Right.
of these things that gave the individual more rights over their data. And then conversely, also imposed a lot of restrictions and a lot of requirements on essentially all of the enterprises handling that data. I didn't think about that too much at the time, but because you're always smarter in hindsight, then I can kind of trace it back to, my own interest in personally being able to just optimize my own physiology based on data. So, I mean, I'm an extreme data geek in this regard. What I mean
Right.
by that is I've optimized my diet by doing blood draws. So, looking at what are my actually blood levels when I change my diet every 3 months. Luckily, I had a very, very willing physician that was willing to go along with that for me.
Yeah.
But similarly, as we've had all of these new types of wearables and devices, then I kind of got very much into that world, and that sort of led to this notion of what I'm working on now with Prifina, which is we have all of this data, we have all these devices, we have all of this around us in our fingertips, but it still feels completely underutilized. Like it's not something that, even though it's yours legally, it's not really usable. And that's something
Right.
that we sought out to kind of solve and really kind of turn the equation around that, why don't we all just have this data and be able to use it for something that's valuable for us?
Yeah. Um, I'm looking through Profina's website before and again now because I wanted to refresh my memory. And on the one hand, really early on, in like 2017, I'm pretty sure early 2018, I started to see similar ideas, but more about as what you're doing here with Prifina with the wearable data, but it was more about location, and then another one was more about like V2V type data, vehicle to vehicle, collecting that sort of stuff and
Sure.
being able to stream it. Like, are you? It's not, you said you have to think you play in the same sandbox, but yours is specifically for more like the data generated by like an Apple Watch, a Fitbit, maybe some a Fossil watch,
Yeah, and I
with
think it
Wear
kind of
OS or
goes
something like that.
into the market timing and the market maturity overall. So
Mm-hmm.
our long-term view is that all the apps today are wrong. That's just like flat out everything that we built is incorrect because the data is in the company's own server and the company's silo and doesn't actually
Right.
shouldn't be there. It should be with you. So we can take that very long-term view, and if you start kind of extrapolating that, then I mean everything means everything. But that being said, you can't start with everything. So we started looking at and we started experimenting with tens of thousands of developers that, okay, what are the data sets that we as individuals actually care the most about? And then also, what is an exploding data set? And it turns out these personal devices, I mean, our expectation is that in a few years, we're going to have sensors on everything, like absolutely everything in your home, on your body, in your clothes, in your
Right.
car. The car already has so much connected intelligence, but it's not really sharing it with you; it's sharing it with somebody else.
Yeah.
Um, but then, I mean, the question becomes that, okay, so what? And I think our view was that if you take the common trend in different markets, let's say, for example, cameras, cameras started off being all about the lenses and all about the hardware. And then nowadays, it's pretty much all about the software. That the
Yeah.
software actually does most of the calibration. It enhances and corrects the images, and it does lots of intelligent things. So in a way, we expect the same thing to happen to all of these personal sensors. Like, it doesn't matter if you're talking about an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring or something else. I mean, they're just sensors at the end of the day. But then you have this interesting thing that the data that's generated, that's legally yours. So in a way, you have all this data that these sensors are generating about you, but we don't really have that software layer yet. So that's kind of where we step in, that we essentially we help the individual collect all these data points into what we call their own personal data cloud. And then we overlay this with this software layer where we organize these data objects in a way that they're actually easily usable by developers. And this is where the developers come in, that once you have these data objects like heart rate, sleep, activity, location data, whatnot, then I mean, you can build a bunch of stuff. Like you can take, for example, neighborhoods are here in San Francisco that if I want to lower my stress, then there's certainly, there's better neighborhoods for me to walk in based on my data, as opposed to if I want to go out for a fright, then maybe there's some neighborhoods that'll do that for me here in the city. But it's sort of like, talking about being data driven. You can do so many different things with these data sets that it kind of feels like we're just inching toward this type of a market where anybody can actually use this. And it'll start with us. It starts with the wearables, and wearables you can actually take a broad view at, because you have so many different devices. Like your phone is a wearable
Yeah.
at the one extreme, and it has so much data. But at the same time, all that data is siloed away. So that's where we need this common layer that we can essentially expose a bunch of things on. There's actually also a particular point that one of the things that I absolutely love is developer creativity. And once you can expose something that, you have this data set where you have location, heart rate, you have stress, you have activity, you have sleep, you have weather, you have, all sorts of different types of things. And then you say that, to a group of 10,000 developers, what can you build? I mean, you really get some amazing things. Like you get what type of cat songs calm you down, but you also then get like, optimize a walking route based on your stress, or how to meditate in the best possible way, or how does your
Right.
diet impact your HRV and things like these. But that's kind of the way that we're looking at this. It is really the long-term play that if data becomes something that we can really have at our fingertips, and I think that that is possible, then I mean, basically what we're looking at is a new consumer market where if anybody can essentially help you get value from that, developers can build any type of app from that. then I mean, you're kind of lowering the barrier for a lot of folks that don't have access to that data. And that's where we see that this market is going. And wearables are, it's a personal fascination of mine. It's something that we share in the team. It's an exploding market, but we can very easily see that, for example, you mentioned the car, that maybe your car should know also how stressed you are before, for example, my car, sometimes it corrects me when I'm driving. So it would probably like to know if I'm, stressed out of my mind when I, sit behind the wheel. So those are absolutely things that are going to happen. But then also incidental things from there, like, for example, what about car insurance? Car insurance could probably also be a lot smarter if it knew about your stress levels. But this is where you then get into the privacy and the ethics aspect,
Yeah.
which is where we believe that this does have to be decentralized, that you cannot, it's not enough that the individual keeps this data. It's also absolutely imperative that the individual is the one that actually uses it, because
Right.
then the data never leaves a person.
Yeah. I spent 2.5 years, my entry into being in blockchain and crypto full time was spending that first 2.5 years with an organization called Bloom Protocol, which is similar viewpoint, but all about identity
Sure.
specifically. So, and then when you were talking earlier about taking your own, like taking blood draws and having that analyzed every 3 months, it actually reminded me a lot of Kevin Rose, who is not certainly not the original biohacker by any means, but made a lot of this more known. The fact that the people were doing this sort of thing through his podcasts and Dig Nation back in the day when that was still a thing, and so it immediately got me thinking about the Aura Ring, because I'm pretty sure he's an investor in there. I was looking at Prifina's website, and that's one of the data sources which it looks like the platform that you guys have built so far, this Prifina data model 0.1, will actually take, and help you analyze. So yeah, it got me thinking about, God, I don't know, 10
Yeah.
years ago now, when I was hearing about that sort of stuff originally, when biohacking really took off and became a little bit more mainstream. And then hearing about devices like that, and like you guys, you've covered a lot of ground here with this Perfina data model. What can you
And
explain
I
the
think
data
the
model a little bit and
biohackers,
go
yeah,
ahead?
the biohackers, they didn't really kind of go anywhere. Like, if you think about,
No,
for example, drawing blood every 3 months, I mean, that's idiotic, because that's like, super invasive, super
agreed.
waste of medical resources and all of that. But, everybody's young once, so, or younger. Um, that's funny. Anyway, but if you think about it, then that's actually a huge community nowadays. And I think it's
Yes.
just transformed a little bit. Like, for example, talking about the Aura Ring, I've been using the Aura Ring for a while, and we know the founders of the company. I'm a Finnish engineer, they're Finnish, so that's one of the connections there. But at the
Is
same
this like a
time, I
German
had
engineering thing? Like where like there's a distinction of like
almost.
German engineering. Now we need to have a distinction for Finnish engineers too.
Yeah, that's like, both of us, both nationalities kind of fit into this stubborn engineer mold. So that's something that we have going for us. But even as an Aura user, what I do with this is I actually use Postman to ping their API to retrieve my data into my own tables, into my own graphs, because
Okay.
the Aura app is great, but it's anytime when you're doing something for a large population, then you have to kind of figure out, like, what does the largest population benefit from? And the reality is that I'm interested in very specific things. Like, I'm interested in my running pace compared with my heart rate over time.
Yeah.
And none of the UIs are going to give me that. But, pinging the API and the data source, that does. But this is, like you said, this is one of those personal data devices that we see has, I mean, it's also exploded in popularity, and it's really good for sleep tracking, for example.
Hmm.
But then certainly we're kind of getting to this stage that it almost has to be device agnostic. And this is what we're trying to achieve, that
Right.
with the data model that we have Aura working, we have Fitbit working, and we have a bunch of others that we're kind of combining into, let's say, this data layer. But the reality is that every single one of them is unique. Like, every single one, like, how many devices does Fitbit have? I mean, Fitbit even has smart scales.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of map every single one of them. Then you have to figure out, like, how do you not only enrich them and make them compatible, because some of them have measurement intervals and I don't know, 50 milliseconds, some do every 5 seconds, some do every 15 minutes. So you can't treat them all the same. But then you also have to enrich them. And this is where our data engineering background comes in, that you have to make sure that the timestamps work, that the way that you filter them works, the way that you combine them. And so that's really like, it's like kiddie wheels for anybody that's starting on this, so that you get the right data, but also in the right format, in the right way for whatever you're trying to build. But the vision is for us that we have a dedicated data engineering team that's just kind of going ahead on personal devices and prioritizing them. But this is also where the open source protocol comes in, that we have a nice community, which, they build different types of ways of utilizing the data, different types of data connectors, different types of data hooks, because by no means should it be something that, we control all the data connectors that we have, because there's so many devices and we're getting more and more all the time. So that's something where we want to empower the community as well, that if somebody's got a clever new source that they want to use, then fantastic. If they've got a clever new way of utilizing some existing source, fantastic.
Right.
But that's something that, when we look at these, then we have some of those sensors there, but it's just incredible what type of sensors you have. Like you have the levels sensor, and these, what's it called, continuous glucose monitoring ones, where you can get glucose data. You don't have to go to a hospital anymore. You have a bunch of these others. So I think the biohackers, they sort of graduated a little bit. I'm sure that there's a bunch of us that are still doing our personal experiments, but at the same time, I think we're kind of getting to the stage that, like you said, it's becoming less niche and a little bit more mainstream. And I think essentially, if you ask somebody that, have they ever looked at their steps, whether or not you actually believe that that's helpful, but if you just ask them that, they ever looked at your steps, I would guarantee that, the majority would have seen a steps count somewhere. So that becomes mainstream. And I think especially in the last 2 years, unfortunately, it becomes also something that, where it's become something that people are acutely aware of, that there's so much data, and in some circumstances it's either misused, or then it's not used enough, or they're not deriving enough of the value themselves. So I think it's just, if we just think about like where we expect it to go, then we're just going to have more and more of those all the time.
So I'm curious about like the actual platform. I started scrolling through the other data sources, and I realized, oh, like this goes way beyond fitness. You've got purchase data like from Amazon that I could import, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Apple, Pinterest. Like what are people doing with these other types of information, like Lyft and Uber? I guess whether you're a driver or an actual customer, like what are they doing with all these different kinds of data beyond the health stuff?
Yeah. And we really centralized and focused our energy on the health and wellness for now.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, because we have a vibrant community that was interested in all sorts of different data sets, then we just wanted to list the things that have been explored. Like, for example, if you take from Google, you can take your location history. Like,
Right.
wherever Google has ever pinned you on a GPS coordinate, then
Which
you
I've
can
turned
get
off.
that. And then if you combine that, for example, with purchase history, then now you could do an app where it says that, where has Derek had ice cream in his life, and whether or not somebody's interested in that app, I don't know, but you could do that.
Yeah.
And this is the great thing about democratizing something like that we don't have to choose. Like, we don't have to be the gatekeepers and saying that what's a good app and what's a bad app.
Right.
All that we care about is that user has the data. It's your data, you keep it, you don't have to share it. And then the apps process the data on your side. And when we call it on your side, but basically it's a decentralized processing, which means that it actually is processing the data on your device. So the data is not going anywhere, it's essentially staying with you. But in a way, we kind of take that a little bit beyond that. It's not just the physical location or the technical model, it's almost like the agency. Because if you think about like some of those things like purchase data, then that data is used by a bunch of folks, but just not by you. And those folks are using it to essentially optimize the price that you're willing to pay, so that they make the most money. And that's fine. Business is business.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if you were using that data, then you would optimize something completely different than essentially the merchant's revenue. So this is kind of where we see that bringing more of this in-house in a way to you so that you can actually utilize it, then you can do lots of different things. But for now, we've just found that there's so many things that we can do just with the health and the wearables that we haven't ourselves gone too deep into those. But this is in a private beta at this stage, which means that, if a developer or a company comes to us and says that, hey, I've got this really cool data connector and I want to use it for, I don't know, optimizing somebody's life insurance based on their ice cream eating habits, then we would certainly listen. And then, there's nothing preventing them from building it.
Yeah.
But it's just that our own focus has to be in a certain critical mass.
Yeah, I think the last thing I want to know is how many times I've eaten ice cream in the past. And actually, what I was thinking about with the shopping data is more like, do I have a tendency to spend more if I'm shopping at night online versus during the day,
Sure.
or something like that, or like that sort of thing, like time of day influences. Oh, that was a day I ate a lot or I drank a lot. I went
Yeah,
buck
yeah.
wild on
So,
Amazon.
for example, compare your glucose data or your stress data with your shopping habits.
Yeah.
You can easily list at least like a couple dozen different use cases directly just from those data sets. How does stress impact buying habits? Do you buy different types of things when you're stressed? How about your sleep? How about your glucose levels? So I think this is kind of the point that we have certain use cases that we are ourselves developing with certain companies and certain partners so that we kind of can prove out the models, and
Yeah.
then we can kind of establish these spearheads in terms of these lofty goals that we have, that let's re-architect the entire internet. But that being said, then the goal is very much that anybody can build. And the vision that we have is that if anybody can build on data, and then the consumer themselves, they can choose what type of apps that they use, and it can really be a free market. That's sort of like, that's a leveling effect for the entire data market. And like you and I were talking a little bit about the start in terms of what's going on with like data privacy regulations and a lot of these companies and these really, really big media titles around like monopolies and so on and so forth. And my view is that, that's the reality, that's today. But if we can actually open the data market so that anybody can build, and then the consumers can choose what they use and what's, valuable for them, in a way, we're kind of looking ahead and we're building something better. And it kind of, from an engineer's point of view, that seems like the solution. That instead of focusing on like where we are today and why we got here and what's not working, and can we just build something better?
Yeah.
And that's very much our ethos in our company. That if we empower these developers, then we're going to come up with some amazing things.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I don't like when people come to me and just like whine and complain, and I'm like, okay, so how do we solve this? You vented
That's
for
right.
the last 10 minutes. Now what? And and for me, it's just much more constructive to have a goal and to start working towards it. So it sounds like you've got a similar mindset. Um, I'm curious, like, you've got links to GitHub repos and stuff like that. Like, how technically inclined does somebody need to be right now in order to actually take advantage of this? I mean, like, it's easy to click get Fitbit data, get a CSV and put it somewhere else. That's fairly simple. But like spinning up, a dev environment on the command line or something like
Yeah.
that, and getting your own like localhost 3000 or something like that up and running is a whole other level for most people.
Yeah, you're right. And in a way, we are at this stage that our primary focus right now is on the builders, so the developers and the companies and those that are technically inclined. But this is just a function of the stage that we're at.
Yeah.
So in a way, the end users right now, then they would interact with these companies. So for example, one of the great use cases that we have is a user-owned personal avatar, which is an avatar that reacts to your own physiological data. The dude's grumpy if you're stressed, and they're tired, they slouch if you're tired, and becomes like a personal Tamagotchi that, you don't want the dude to be sad.
Right.
So you take better care of yourself. So in a way, the consumer would interact with that avatar at this stage. And then in order to get access to that, then they would be part of this network where essentially this company is building this and testing this out. But this is all going to change in the next 6 months or so.
Mm.
So right now we're very much focused on these builders. So whenever somebody's got a great idea, then they can come to us and we can help them get started and give them access, and they can build it, they can test it out. But then longer term, we kind of look at this as having to be it has to be simple for the consumer.
Yeah.
that in a way you can go in as a data geek, you can click a couple of buttons, everything's automated, you can get access to your data, you can view it. But then more importantly, you can get access to these apps that these developers have built so that you can actually activate this data, because it's great if you can get a CSV or an archive dump from Google with all of your data, and then you're sitting there with 9.4 gigabytes of, different types of files, and I'm as happy as the next guy for something like that. Yes, exactly.
Pivot tables, spark lines. Let's visualize this crap. Yeah.
But then what do you do? And then why is your life better based on this? Then that's where the apps come in. That somebody can say that, hey, based on this, I can give you an app that helps you sleep better, or I can give you an app that helps you alert you when your buying behavior is slightly disadvantageous for your overall wealth creation, or whatever it is. So that's why it has to be developer first at this stage. But that being said, then that changes in about 6 months, or then they're in where essentially it becomes a lot more about, okay, I got my data, I can power this app's cool, and I've got my data, I can also power this app, and hey, what else can I do with it? And then it becomes something that's just a different way of using apps at the end of the day.
So if you don't want to reveal this, that at this point, that's fine. But I'm just curious, does that mean then, because you want the user to be in full control of their data, which obviously is the ideal, are we talking about normal executable, installation, local clients, or because a web app, would remove a lot of that, where then we're relying on Prifina to host the data for us?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think there's different elements. So the way that we look at it is that not only are we giving the end user a place to keep their data, but we're actually giving them a cloud environment where they are the root user. So it's not just the data, it's actually the entire runtime environment and the entire, just everything that they've got there.
Right.
And it means that then they can use that environment to run the apps.
Okay.
So instead of running the apps in, God forbid, our cloud or we don't have servers as a company. We are a completely serverless company. So we don't have logs either. So we don't see anything. We have no access. But that being said, you can run headless apps in your own cloud. You can run serverless apps in your own browser. You can run local apps in your iPhone. But you could even use this cloud environment to run, connected IoT apps, because it's just an endpoint that you ping at the end of the day. So in a way, we've followed that line that it's not enough that the user has their data, because I've also been in the blockchain space for a while, and I think the amount of data that we're talking about here, and I mean, putting it into a box on your table, that just seems so backwards to me. What happens to that box then, and what can that box do?
Right.
How are you going to transfer that data back and forth into your personal AI app that needs to be fed, all the time?
Yeah.
That doesn't really work. So the only environment that we could think about was the cloud environment. And the only way that we could guarantee that it is actually yours is that you have to be the root user. That everybody has to be secondary to you. Now, this environment, everything that's going on with distributed compute and everything that's going on there, I mean, it's obviously evolving very rapidly. So we're kind of keeping tabs on those. And our primary focus is to make it super easy and super user-controlled, or absolutely user-controlled to begin with. But then down the line, if we can make it more distributed, more decentralized, we can kind of go into decentralizing the data itself.
Mm-hmm.
Then, I mean, those are super, super interesting avenues that we're very, very excited about. But I think one of the constraints that we have is that, we're talking about a lot of data. So you can't be moving it back and forth all the time. And you also can't be storing it somewhere which is not 100% secure.
Right. Yeah. Tough problems to tackle. We've talked a little bit about that on the show before, and I don't think there are any easy answers. and I'm not sure anybody has a bulletproof solution at this point.
But there are smart people working on those, which is great.
Absolutely.
Whenever you have smart folks that kind of recognize those, and I'm quite optimistic that we'll see something cool come out of it. But it's also then the time and maturity that, where does it kind of cross the chasm from going from early adopter to something that is, let's say, more mainstream and more mature.
So I think you already give us a bit of a preview here on what's on the horizon for Prifina throughout this year, and hopefully in about 6 months or so. If everything goes well, you're looking to do more of a consumer facing launch. Do I have that right?
Yeah, or I mean, basically, if you think about it, then these builders that we're working with, they build different types of apps. Those apps have users.
Mm.
So they anyway end up essentially as an introduction to this ecosystem and they end up testing them out. And then, like any person, what we've noticed is if they test out one app and they've got their data, they can power that one app, then they very quickly start asking this question that what else can I do?
Yeah.
So then, once you've done the synchronizations and you've got your data, then it's sort of like keys to a car that you can just plug it in into all sorts of different things and hopefully get new, unique, and valuable experiences to you. So in a way, I think over time, we want to build up a strong consumer brand. And we want to give the option that, there's a couple of ways that you can use apps. If you use them this way, then you get to keep all the data and then the data actually represents you and not somebody else. But that's a long-term play.
Yeah.
So that takes a while until we're there. But I think now essentially the interesting thing is really just kind of going deeper into different types of use cases and just seeing how people experience them. Because ultimately the experience that we want to create for the end user is that, this shouldn't be just interesting for a data geek. This should be something that's absolutely vanilla that, if asked, then why wouldn't you want to keep your data? And I think that that's kind of where we're going over time, that people are being much more aware and they're being made much more aware about like not just essentially who's using data, but also the value imbalance in terms of the use of data. So I think there essentially, if we can go out and we can provide an option that, hey, it's up to you. You can use it this way or you can use it that way. But that takes time. So I think, over this year, we'll see a lot of these apps go to market and kind of test them out, and we'll essentially see a lot of user interactions from there. But then I think it's also interesting for us to see how the developer community develops, because the developers are, I mean, obviously they're also users themselves,
Yeah.
but they are slightly different types of users. So a lot of them are like this next generation biohackers that, they've got frustrated with the tools that they've got, and they have a very clear idea of how I want to ingest and see certain type of things. So that's something that I'm personally quite excited about, just seeing what type of things there are and then what type of following they get. Because if somebody's identified a problem, then most likely they'll also essentially very quickly network with other folks that have that exact same thing. Because these niches, they might be niches, but we're still talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. And there's a lot of those pockets.
Yeah. I was actually just thinking to myself, Easter's coming up, which means Lent. 4 or 5 weeks before that, I guess 4 weeks, 28 days, whatever. Um, I'm such a bad Christian, it doesn't really matter anymore. Regardless, I was thinking the whole point of Lent, at least if you're a Christian, is to give something up. And I was thinking to myself, oh, well, like if somebody decided that they needed to watch less TV, right? Or like give up Netflix or give up Amazon Prime Video for Lent, 40 days, that's probably what it is. Um,
Mm.
then if you had Netflix data coming in plus health data plus shopping data, etc., you could actually see, what parts of your life, like how you compensated for not watching TV.
Sure.
Hopefully it's some exercise, some better eating or something like that, as opposed to your life getting worse somehow. But like that would be a really interesting thing to see. It'd be like, oh, January, February, here was my baseline, and then in March time frame ish,
Yeah.
I lost
And you
five
can
pounds.
extrapolate that
My
actually
stress
a
went
lot.
down.
Yeah. And you can actually extrapolate that a lot as well. Like if you start thinking about something like that, then you've got a change in behavior. And then you're interested in what is the impact?
Yeah.
What is the impact from that change of behavior? So we actually have a lot of use cases like that, which is that, maybe somebody gives you a certain type of supplements or vitamins or certain pills. And maybe the typical feedback loop is that you start taking them, then you visit your doctor in 6
Right.
months, in 6 months, in 6 months, and you adjust them, adjust them, adjust them. Well, why couldn't you measure them every day yourself? Like, why couldn't you, like, if you're taking, I don't know, weight loss is an easy one, but let's say stress management, if you're changing a routine, then you could just monitor that with your HRV and
Yeah.
your sleep and so on and so forth. So that's something where any type of habit changing, when you're looking at like, is this actually working for me? Then that's where these types of, at the end of the day, what you're building with Prifina is individualized apps that they are decentralized, but maybe more relevant. They're individualized. They're
Mm-hmm.
actually running on your data,
Yeah.
not somebody like you, but they're running on your data and they're training on your data, which means that, because it's not sharing any data, all of it stays with you. It actually ends up being quite representative of what works for you. And we actually find here that people have so many different variables that it's very hard to do like a one size fits all. Like some people, their stress goes down when they meditate in the morning. Some people, it goes down more when they meditate in the evening. That's like a combination of so many different types of factors. But the great thing is you can measure all of those. And this is kind of goes back to when I was saying that, it just feels like all of this is underutilized. Like we're not measuring that.
Yeah.
Like you have lots of meditation apps, but even they aren't measuring your stress. Why? Why aren't they? And it could be actually as simple as asking you that, hey, Derek, you seem a little, how are you feeling today? And then based on that, it would suggest what type of meditation to do. I mean, even better, it would just measure it and say that, hey, you seem stressed, do this one.
Yeah. A smart
But
app that
we're
would just
not
be like,
there. And I
this is the
think
one
we're
you
just,
need. You need this 20
that's right.
minute long, super chill meditation. We're going to walk you through this exercise. Yeah. I mean, like, on the one hand, I'm sure there are people who would be like, ooh, I don't want you to choose for me. Sure. Okay. Ignore the recommendation. Pick your own, right? Um,
That's right.
but I almost feels like this is an important piece of this individualized medicine phenomena that was supposed to happen like 20 years ago. And but because the data is so abstracted, like I can see my heart rate right this second, but I don't get super granular data if I go open up the Apple Health app tomorrow, even, or 3 months from now. I get averages over time. The ability to drill in and be like, oh yeah, I remember that day and I was super stressed out and I remember why. It's almost non-existent. And then you have to hope and pray that all these other apps actually play well with Apple Health or Google Health or whatever, and that the data
That's
exchange
right.
is actually happening reliably, and that the data is being interpreted appropriately. Whereas if I'm the type of person who, yeah, maybe once a month I dump all my data in here, or I'd run some sort of Zapier automation type thing, right, and just dump it all in once a day. Like you said, you're running Postman to ping the API, bring the data in. Could do that, midnight every night, and actually have much more granular data and be able to pinpoint those times where, like, oh yeah, I was trying this
That's right.
thing. A week later, cycling every day or whatever, my resting heart rate's down, I'm eating better, etc. Great, that's something I'm going to keep doing, and now I can add something on top. Or it's not helping, I haven't lost any weight, I'm not feeling any better, etc. Throw that away or do it at a different time of day, because what I'm doing right now is obviously not working. You don't need to wait 3 or 4 weeks or 6 months to get that sort of feedback.
That's right. And I think there's so many layers to that. But I think it feels almost crazy that in kind of entering the Web3 that we don't have this data. Like, if however you're using it, you should have it.
Yeah.
Like it should be something that you could just keep it somewhere and then maybe it interests you in 4 years. Like who knows? But the fact that we don't have that, and the fact that it's like, it is ours legally, but it's not really. It's like
Yeah.
all around the ether, and somebody else is looking at it, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of the crazy bit. But then there's the other bit, which is that in order to actually make sense of it, in like, let's take, for example, the example of a heart rate. It's not enough that you have the heart rate. Like, for example, if my heart rate is 78 beats per minute right now, what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you anything. What am I sleeping? Is it 78? If I'm sleeping, then shit, we got a problem. Is it 78 and I'm running? Well, then again, we've got a
Yeah.
problem. Am I a kid? Am I an adult? What am I doing? What am I listening to? What am I looking at? So this is also the thing. How does my genetics play into
Mm-hmm.
this? So this is also kind of the thing that at the end of the day, we kind of think about this as a personal data lake of sorts, that you have to have a lot of this contextual data to do the most advanced things. But the most advanced things, they might actually save your life. So it could be things like one of our partners, they say that they have clear data, they know the optimal time to have a heart attack, but unfortunately, people don't typically have that choice. But based on this data, they can also predict your likelihood to have a heart attack
Yeah.
based on different types of factors. And these are things that, it almost seems, I don't know, it seems really odd that we have the capability to predict something as fundamental as a heart attack or, strokes and things like that. but we don't have any way of an individual actually being able to utilize that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's on part the cool thing about working on Prifina, that I see it as a fundamental thing for Web3 and where we're going, that we need to have our data, otherwise how we're going to power this ecosystem and so on and so forth. But then the second part is that there's almost this immediacy that we're not using this right now, and it seems absolutely ridiculous and almost frivolous in a sense that we should be using this. Like, this should be absolutely, like, you shouldn't have to be a data geek to essentially just be alerted that, hey, you're likely to have a heart attack next week actually just went up.
Right.
So there's different layers, of course, and I think essentially one of the things that we've noticed is that people tend to engage with things that people have different levels where they get in. Like, not everybody goes in thinking that, how do I prevent my heart attack? But they might go in and say that, hey, I want to sleep better. And that's great as an entry point. Just being more aware of your data, and being more aware of like your physiological, readings and so on and so forth. That's a great starting point for a little bit more user agency. But for example, you mentioned like the ride sharing apps. Then, a lot of these things, they have a ton of utility. Like, for example, what if you forced the driver to open a stress score or a sleep score or a fatigue score every time they open the, like ride sharing driver app? Whether or not they do anything different, I don't know. But if they all see that, hey, your readiness is a 1, or your readiness is a 10, I'm sure that they would think that, hey, maybe it's not okay that I'm driving after 17 hours of driving, that maybe I should probably take a break. So just kind of being made aware of something, that can already have a huge lasting impact. But it has to be the user. Like, you have to make the individual themselves aware, and for them to themselves choose what to do.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, most people don't like being told what to do. So if it comes from yourself that I've seen this, I want to do X, Y, and Z, then it becomes a lot more powerful, and it becomes a lot more lasting as well for individuals.
Yeah, I think it would almost be nice if I was an Uber or Lyft driver to actually know how my customer that's about to get into the car is feeling. Like, and hopefully that's opt-in, right? Like, you get your Uber. I used it a lot in France last year because I needed to get places. And one really cool thing was like, oh, if you hold this up and like, the driver's gonna be looking for this color. Well, just before that prompt, you could say like, just wondering like how you're feeling today. You're like, I'm super grumpy. The driver could then know like, light touch, easy go. Like if I said I don't want conversation, I really don't want conversation right now, because that's the thing. Like, they ask you like, do you want to engage in a conversation with your driver? Depending on the day, yes or no. And if I'm normally a chatty Cathy and today I'm super grumpy, that's literally the opposite signal that I normally give Uber or Lyft or whatever. And so today, be nice when I get in the car, and then just take me where I said I gotta go. And if my attitude changes and I start talking, then obviously, we can start getting chatty, and you can tell me about your life, or
Right.
driving around Paris or Cleveland or wherever. But like they ask for certain preferences. That's the word I'm looking for. But those preferences changes with your mood, changes with your diet, changes with your how much sleep you got, etc. And so that would actually be an opportune time to ask for a little bit more data for a very specific reason. And in those cases, I think I'd be
I agree.
remembering what my preferences are. I'd be like, yeah, no, today is not the day. Like, just don't. Or
that's right. And it could be something super simple, like, do you want to talk, thumbs up, thumbs down? And you're like, nope.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be more complicated.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't need to be a scale. It could just be, how you feeling? Good, bad, neutral, something like that.
But that type of data, let's call it like metadata, or different types of contextual data. It is actually, let's be honest. Most of that data right now sucks. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And it just depends on the fact that it's not really. The user isn't really involved in that. Like, if you start thinking about how many online platforms you have accounts with and how many of those are current, then the problem is that all the ones that aren't current, then they're going to be misleading in some way. My favorite example is restaurant recommendations. That let's say that you're a big burger guy and then you have a heart attack and now you're off meat.
Yeah.
You're still going to get burger ads all the time because that's your history. So being able to say that, hey, I know that my 7 years of diet consists of burgers, but actually now plant-based only, that is a huge flip right away in behavioral. But the only place where you can get that is a person themselves.
Yeah.
So this is kind of where we go back to this type of concept of the just the source of truth, that if you wanted a consumer preference, and if you wanted to know, for example, that, I don't know, like, for example, do you enjoy dialogue typically? How about today? Then, the only place or the only person to ask is the user themselves. And then you could actually create different protocols for these. Like, you could, for example, retrieve user preferences if the user has made them available for something like an Uber pickup. But then you could also have a way of essentially confirming that maybe there's some things where you actually want the user to kind of double check and say that, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that goes actually quite far, that it's not just those things, but it's almost like, wherever your data is used, you could almost think of it like some places where your data is used, you would have to confirm that, yes, I am actually using this. Very similar to how you use your visa when you're, you get a fraud alert from Visa that, are you in Manchester buying dog food? And you're like, no, I'm not. And that's very simple, that, okay, you're not there. It's a fraudulent transaction.
You're gonna freeze your card.
Well, what about the same for your data? That, if your data is used for, I don't know, creating a social media profile, then why couldn't you just check that from your endpoint, that, is this actually Derek? And then you say that, well, actually it's not.
Yeah.
So all of these types of things, like, if you can get the user to actually, just have that power, then all of these things become almost natural. That, why shouldn't we have a data fraud prevention where you just ping the user's endpoint and then they just say thumbs up, thumbs down that this is correct or this is fraudulent?
Yeah.
But again, I think this goes back to Web3, that I can't see a Web3 future without this. Like, this is absolutely the underpinning for anything that we have in the long term. But that being said, we kind of have to take it one step at a time, that we have to start somewhere. And then once you have these types of natural experiences, that of course it should be like this, that why would I give up my data? Why would I use this in a different way? Then you get into like, okay, if we are starting from that point that I have the data, what can we actually do? Because then you can start architecting all sorts of different interesting things, but kind of have to always pace it, that you have to take the short term and then you have to kind of be very mindful that where we're going in the longer term.
Yeah. If you have a couple minutes, I want to ask two hopefully quick questions, and we'll end on a positive note as well. But first, I want to ask about what sort of challenges you've had, and maybe what you anticipate experiencing as you continue to reach out to, or continue to hopefully be able to bring in more data and that sort of thing. You've got you've had to identify here on a few of the data sources. You probably need to be a resident of California, or subject to GDPR in order to get your data out of this particular platform. Some of them make it super easy, and some of them it takes weeks for them to basically provide a CSV dump of some kind or something like that. Are you having a lot of trouble? Are you anticipating more trouble getting companies to be open about their data so that users can take it out and do something with it?
So surprisingly, the data part is a lot of work, but it's not really a bottleneck. And what I mean by that is that I think we've got to this stage that the regulation and the law is quite clear, that the data is yours. And if you want the data via an API, via a dump, via some type of channel, then you're gonna get it.
Yeah.
Some companies can make that difficult. That's on them. But we kind of have to look at it from a direction point of view, that we're able to get actually a ton of data already today. So that's not really a problem. I would say that essentially the thing that is and continues to be a challenge, and don't get me wrong, that's a lot of work, and that's where we'll have to hire and we'll have to get more folks. But that's just work, nothing to be afraid of. But then the second part is really that what do we do with this? And that's something that will continue to be a challenge, because in a way, if you think about the monumental vision that we have, that, let's in Web3 make sure that the individual can feed all sorts of different types of applications. We need to build all those applications, and we're not going to build them ourselves. Like, there's no way on earth. So that's where we need essentially great companies that have that want to represent and empower their consumers, that want to build new experiences. Small companies, but also the largest companies, and that's something that that is the Herculean task that we have. That we have to kind of figure out how do we get to that critical mass, because in a way we look at where we need to get to as being able to provide the user a choice that do you want to use this so that you keep the data, or do you want to use this so that you give up the data? And to me, it's a 10x question. I mean, it's 10 times easier to justify that. Why don't I just keep it? But at the same time, we have to get to that the critical mass of the applications and the uses of the data. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
That actually backs up that statement that it's not just about getting the same type of experiences. It's actually getting better experiences than what we get today, but in a way that is more modern than what we've architected so far. So that's the biggest challenge that we have, that actually fostering and cultivating that community around this and really getting it to the stage that it becomes almost like a no-brainer that, of course, I want to do this.
Yeah. Okay. And I forget what the positive note I wanted to end on was. Um, I guess I'll flip it around to this question. What sort of interest have you had from device makers, maybe some larger established software developers and people like that in order to
Yeah.
work with Prifina, work with the platform, build apps and maybe even build devices that accept either, have like a Prifina widget or something like that, or integrate closely with the model that you guys are building.
Yeah. So one of the greatest things about building this company is that we get to work with absolutely brilliant people and brilliant companies. I hear a lot of folks talking about how it's really hard to hire. Well, it's not hard for us. It's hard for us to be able to afford everybody, absolutely. But that being said, we have developers and data scientists in our community that they have this thirst for essentially being able to build new types of applications based on data, but they just lack the access to the data. And then I think the entire Web3 push has made essentially like this opportunity to create a new consumer market very visible for a lot of consumer companies, where they think about it almost in a way that how do they create a modern luxury in a way that, of course you should have your data, that should be a no-brainer, but how do they create like the experience around that? But I mean, I'll tell you what, we've even had conversations with a number of insurance companies, banks, different types of larger institutions that are looking at, okay, we have a lot of intelligent things that we can do, but with the current models, we can't do them. So basically, because of privacy or legal or any type of things, then the company themselves, they cannot collect or process the data.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if they could, or if they could have the user do it themselves, then the user would get a lot of value.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of those things that we've seen some primitive starts in, for example, insurance, where you have like what's it called? You have like John Hancock's Vitality program, where you can get better, better insurance based on your behavioral activity, and
Yeah.
that's all great.
Driving
It's still
behavior.
relatively primitive, but it aligns your interests. That the insurance company doesn't want you to die, and you don't want to die either. So it's sort of like a very very easy, let's say, give and take, or very very simple win-win. But I think we'll see even more of those, and I think one of the things that I'm quite excited about this year or next is that my prediction is that we'll see actually huge consumer companies come out with big statements around that we're actually different, that we allow you to have your data and we allow you to benefit from your data, and we are empowering you with this because our core competence is really, for example, building a device or building an experience or something else. But I think it's going to get a lot more mainstream, that people expect certain type of things, but they're also becoming a lot more aware of just all the data points that are out there that they could leverage. So I think a lot of consumer brands will be able to turn that around, and they'll be able to say that, hey, let's turn this discussion from a data privacy discussion to a data value discussion, and let's showcase that, hey, with our brand, this company can actually customers of this company can get a elevated service where they essentially retain full control of everything that they've got.
Right.
So I think those are super things that I'm excited about. And especially as we get more of that type of attention, then I think it'll also be quite clear in terms of, what should I say, that it starts to move the needle in a larger conversation. Because I think today the conversation has been rather reactive. But that being said, I think in the future it can be a lot more proactive, where we go in and we say that, okay, the future models don't have to look the same way that they did in the past. We can do something actually a lot more consumer friendly.
Yeah, I agree. I just started thinking, doesn't Pine have an open source watch? Maybe this, yeah, Pine Time. That's right. Where, that to me, like I've got an Apple Watch, I guess I'm part of the problem in one way. Or at least I'm feeding data back to Apple that they're processing and then providing back to me. Like I get that. But then, the Pine Time from the Pine 64 organization, like this is the perfect thing where they probably don't have a place where any of that data, like the heart rate sensor, the step counting that the few things that they do collect, goes. That's not their forte. Whereas some
Right.
sending it to my Prifina container or what have you would be the perfect place to put that, because then not only am I taking it from a device I have full control over, I'm sending it to a location that I have full control over, and I know that Apple or Google wasn't in between um, collecting the data, harvesting it,
Yeah.
etc. So cool.
I think we'll see those types of things. And I mean, you can kind of think about that further. It doesn't have to just be new watch manufacturers. It could be, for example, some of the largest consumer brands.
Oh, sure.
That a lot of them, they have a fantastic consumer brand, but they don't necessarily have the data engineering backgrounds or the data processing. But I would say it's a huge opportunity for those types of organizations to think about how can they essentially play the game but slightly differently, utilize their brand, utilize their consumer awareness, but then essentially not replicate what companies like Apple or devices like Apple Watch have done, but do something of their
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Which then makes you an acquisition target. But we'll
Possibly,
see.
but that's another conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. This is not the right. That's like a Freakonomics or Conversations with Tyler or the Economist type conversation, not private podcast. Marcus, thanks so much for your time today. You were very generous with it,
Thank you,
and
Derek.
for giving us, dropping all this knowledge on us. I'm really excited about Prifina, and hope to see it the next iteration come out over the next few months.
Yep. No, awesome. Thank you so much, Derek, for having me. And anybody that's listening that's interested in, I don't know, maybe you've got a crazy idea in terms of what you could do based on this data, then I mean, just shoot me a note. You can find my details on the website. And I think one of the things that really does move the needle for us is that creativity, that whenever we can harness and really showcase that we can empower somebody to build something that they couldn't otherwise do. I mean, that's always something that we're glad to see.
Yeah, just for people, it's Prifina.com. Prifina.
That's right.
Terrific. Yeah, thanks again. And to everybody listening, until next time, stay free.